Joining me from just outside the nation's capital is Bill Kristol. He is, of course, editor-at-large and co-founder of the Bulwark. He was chief of staff to the vice president under the presidency of George H.W. Bush. I mean, that seems like ancient history, 1988 to 1992. He, of course, founded the Weekly Standard. I remember watching you and Fred Barnes. You'd be on Fox News. You'd be on CNN. Sir, you are well-traveled. You even worked with Daniel Patrick Moynihan in a past life, and you interned, what was it, in the Nixon White House?
It was. I've tried to suppress that from my resume, but there you go. You seem to have discovered it. Everything. I guess everything is public these days on the internet. No.
Well, we had your colleague.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no, we had your colleague Tim Miller on the show, and it's fascinating. There used to be this kind of this Graham Rudman type comedy, like coming in and out. Like they talk about these old hoary stories of Tip O'Neill at the end of the day having lobster with his Republican opponents, and they, put their swords down and everything. It seems like a relic of bipartisan yesteryear. When I see you working with the likes of Daniel Patrick Moynihan and then working with Dan Quayle and then now having voted for Joe Biden and having been a never Trumper, I brought this up to Tim Miller. We never used to see this just, 20 years ago.
It is. I mean, it is striking. And on the whole, unfortunate. One can overly romanticize the good old days. There was a lot of just sort of mutual back scratching and a certain amount of unresponsiveness really to the public. You might say there's an awful lot of elites, getting along with each other, if we can be honest. But having said that, it was a healthier system. And these were admirable people. I mean, I was very fortunate to be able to work for people I really almost exclusively, who I really genuinely admired, learned a lot from, happened to luck into getting some jobs with them. So I've had a very unusual experience in Washington. I think, honestly, I have many, many, many friends who've worked for many people, and some of them have been good, but some not so great. You can't always, obviously, you take what jobs you can, especially when you're young. And so I really have had a lucky experience with people from both parties. I think maybe that helped me a little bit when Trump came along, just having way back in my background worked as a volunteer, as a kid for Hubert Humphrey in the 68. I was in the 10th grade or something. Hubert Humphrey, when he was running for president in 68 for the Democratic nomination, and then Scoop Jackson when I was in college in 72. That didn't go very, very far. I have a good record of working for losing candidates, I would say, from both parties, But and then Moynihan in 76, where I took the summer off and worked for a Senate campaign in New York. Then I became basically a Reagan Republican. It was basically that until 2015, I suppose, or so, but 2016.
So what is that?
But I think it helped me deal with Trump. I noticed that a lot of my younger friends and colleagues who were anti-Trump, they had a tougher time in a funny way. And I'm not saying this is better or worse. It's just sort of different psychologically, tougher time crossing the aisle. They'd grown up in a different era when you were a Republican, and you were a Republican at age 20, you were a Republican at age 40. That was kind of your life, your world, or a Democrat. And it wasn't terrible. It wasn't, they were, intolerant, unpleasant people or anything. It's just that it made it a little more, I don't know, traumatic or dramatic for them to change. Whereas I had, been a Democrat in the 70s, then a Republican in the 80s, and I figured, okay, unfortunately the Republican Party's got off the rails, and I have to go back to being a Democrat.
It does blow my mind, and forgive me, listeners, that I keep coming up with these examples. There's one anecdote is that people were blaming Al Gore in 2001. They're like, if you only had Bill Clinton go and stump for you more in West Virginia, you would have gotten enough. Imagine that, one, right? And then two, I don't know if this is true. Somebody should fact check it. But when Barack Obama took office, 3 out of the 4 senators of the Dakotas were Democrats. You can't even imagine that now.
Right. And Barack Obama, we'll think about this too, who had campaigned obviously against the Iraq War. I mean, he won the Democratic nomination because he was against the Iraq War, and I probably won the presidency partly for that reason, against John McCain, whom I supported and was very close to and really admired. Anyway, Barack Obama, partly because I think he respected Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, but partly to send a signal that, though we differed on the war, the country was united in moving forward, kept Bob Gates as Secretary of Defense for 2 years, and then actually made David Petraeus CIA director. That kind of ill-fated thing, but anyway, who had been obviously in charge running the surge in Iraq. So, I mean, that wasn't that long ago. That's what strikes me the most, right? I mean, we're not talking about, it was obviously different in the 70s and 80s than it was already by 2010, let's say. But even then, there was still more of the old system, and the abruptness and comprehensiveness of the change is pretty striking.
Nobody talks about that autopsy, that postmortem after Romney lost in 2012. Right. But to have somebody come in really out of the blue and rip it up and decide, no, we're going to mine a whole different base, right? The uninspired voter. It's really counterintuitive. You can go back and look at all these YouTube videos of panelists scoffing at the idea of a Trump presidency, that it was it just doesn't happen. The biggest upset before that was here in my district when Eric Cantor lost to the Freedom Caucus person. But nobody would ever imagine that who was looked at as kind of a carnival barker, New York City developer, press hound, somebody who had donated money, after all, to the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2008, and even Kamala Harris as AG as recently as 2011 would be defined with the Republican Party by 2026, would be synonymous. MAGA would take over GOP.
I mean, he's a good demagogue, and I use that word. Well, I do use it somewhat pejoratively, but I was about to say I don't use it pejoratively, but I do use it analytically in a sense. I do think he's very good at stirring up people up, playing to their fears and anxieties and so forth. But also he's a very shrewd observer, obviously, and he was back then, of what was happening beneath the surface. And I don't know if he really saw stuff or he just gambled and got lucky. That's possible too. He thought that was his only path. He wasn't going to win a conventional race. If there were, who's a better Republican with more surface in the party, him or Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz and, Scott Walker and all the other people who were running. So he had to sort of be an outsider and take the gamble. But you got to say he did it in a way that was successful, obviously. And yeah, we sort of forget that now. We take for granted, well, Trump's been dominant in American politics, certainly in Republican politics for a decade. But yeah, we forget how improbable it was.
Bill, are you ever pulled aside and asked about the kind of the Cambrian explosion or whatever, the KT explosion, whatever it was that ultimately enabled Donald Trump? I remember when I was at Business Week, I believe it was my colleague Sheila Kolhatkar had a cover in 2012 or 13, a Donald Trump presidency. It's actually possible. Don't laugh it off. And many people out there saying that the tons of people in the Rust Belt who've lost their homes in the financial crisis, who were told, stick with the center, stick with Barack Obama. Barack Obama comes in. There was hope initially. And finally, by the time it's 2016, you're so fed up. You're so fed up at seeing the banks recapitalize. You're so fed up at having a bankruptcy on your record and having lost that American dream that you just want to stick it to the system. Was it, and I know you must get asked about this, was it just dumb luck, or did he really perceive that we can stick it to the system, that I can thumb my noses at the Bushes, the Obamas, all these people alike, the war, just the entire mass of everything you were promised to. And I'm not necessarily going to give you wage gains or health care, but kind of the satisfaction of grievance and sticking it to the system.
No, I think there's a lot to that. I mean, at the deep level, the system had failed in certain ways or had been perceived to have failed, maybe in some areas where I think you could more fair. It's not so obvious that it was a failure, or maybe it was a partial failure, or, it's slow adapting. In any case, but certainly there was widespread dissatisfaction and there was room for an outsider. And I think the proof of that, incidentally, is that what else happened in 2016? Bernie Sanders almost beat Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. So think about this. It's 2016. It's 7 years since the great crash, or 8 years really. We had come back slowly, but we were back pretty well by 2016. The wars had been resolved, again, not entirely successfully, but we weren't in the middle of Vietnam, right? We weren't in some terrible war we were fighting in the Middle East, so in Syria and Iraq, obviously, against ISIS. But Obama had been depending how you think about it, a successful president, moderately successful president, not so successful, but the country wasn't falling apart. We weren't in the Great Depression. We weren't, as I say, in a major war. And there was so much popular dissatisfaction in both parties that Bernie Sanders, who was a socialist, and is a socialist, and had not even registered as a Democrat. Remember, he was nominally an independent because the Democrats were too corporatist and all this kind of thing, gets, I don't think, 43% of the vote, maybe ultimately, in all the Democratic primaries against Clinton. And Trump gets actually a rather similar number, but of course it's a multi-candidate race, so he wins on the Republican side. So I think it's correct to say that there was clearly stuff happening beneath the surface, and Trump, as well as Sanders, but Trump really was the beneficiary of that. The other side of it is, history has deep causes, and then it has, just kind of adventitious events, and things happen and circumstances matter. And I think Trump also got lucky in that respect. In 2015, we had the migration crisis in Europe, which I think is underrated as a key part of his success. I mean, it was on TV here, especially on Fox. It was bad. It was challenging. It was difficult. It also ultimately, incidentally, worked out okay. Europe is not falling apart, and these countries absorbed more immigrants than they expected they would have to. But in any case, it looked very scary, I'd say, to certain types of Americans. We had challenges here in the U.S. on migration too. With the 2013 compromise bill, the bipartisan bill had failed, even though it got 68 votes in the Senate. That's another, getting back to our earlier thing. I mean, think of that, 68 votes in the Senate, bipartisan bill, on a very controversial topic. It's really, in retrospect, I think kind of a tragedy that it didn't. It never got a vote in the House. It would have had a majority of votes in the House, and President Obama would have signed it. I don't know how much difference that might have made. It might have made some. There were some terrorist acts here, San Bernardino, you remember, and the whole thing came together as kind of a, we're under threat. And Trump then, and that was what the issue that took Trump, in my opinion, to the Republican nomination, and I suppose ultimately to the presidency. And some people say, I've gone on too long, I'll just say this briefly, but some people said to me at the time, and I remember Jeb Bush told me this once, he said, people said to me, you kind of missed it, Jeb. I mean, you were saying, we have to be moderate and have an comprehensive immigration reform, but people were so angry and so upset that they responded to Trump. And Jeb said, but you know what? I wasn't going to say what Trump said. I mean, if the price of getting the nomination is to attack a judge in a civil case that Trump happened to be involved in from Indiana as, quote, a Mexican judge, because he was, even though he's born in America and his parents are from Mexico, well, then everyone's parents are from somewhere, or at least some ancestors are from somewhere. And even if he's not born in America, he's entitled to, if he's, whatever. It's ridiculous, right? But not just that, but of course, all the other nativism, the Muslim ban and so forth. And Jeb said it wasn't that we didn't see that there was that strain in the party. We weren't willing to cater to it, and Trump was. And the final point, I guess, in the party, in the Republican Party, in the conservative side, probably more than people like me were willing to acknowledge, there were these strains that hadn't gone away, I guess the way I would put it, the Buchanan strain, the racial strain. And I think we had suppressed them pretty well, to be honest. And the,
but
Bush,
McCain. Think about the Buchanan strain. I think about you founding the Weekly Standard. Was that shortly after the contract with America in 94?
Right.
1996, I think Pat Buchanan was like the spiciest of the nativist of the GOP stuff. And even then there was a certain honor to the stuff he did. You couldn't imagine, John McCain, who you were advising in 2008, interrupted that protester, that woman, at one of his stump rallies and said, no, he's a good man, Barack Obama. He's not a Muslim. He's not an Arab. All of those taboos have since been shattered. Trump has done it and then some. And it blows the mind to just track it to what used to be the far right versus what is closer center, right of center today. Do you see what I'm saying? It's
yeah, no, totally. I mean,
and I don't know how anybody could have gamed that out, or what corner
right,
would that have come from.
One saw, Buchanan got his 25% whatever, and then he drifted down in the later primaries. And so what do, and this was kind of happened throughout the 2000s, and that was an element of the party, and even the Tea Party, which is not quite the same, but it was there. But again, at the end of the day, the party nominated for president, the Bushes, the McCains, the Romneys, and the leaders of the party in Congress were who? Mitch McConnell, John Boehner, Paul Ryan, Romney Ryan. It's what people say, we should have seen it coming, Bill, that they were already taking everything over. And maybe that's right in retrospect, but I don't know, the Romney Ryan ticket, whatever its virtues or flaws, was a pretty conventional ticket. And so I think that was there, and it just, whether it was inevitable that somehow ultimately that part of the party would prevail, or whether Trump got lucky, and also was a very good demagogue. I come back to the fact he's skillful. I mean, and he had a kind of appeal that Buchanan didn't. He was willing to play the race card and the immigration card and honestly the bigotry card, and also appeal to people's economic anxieties without feeling any need to have any coherent program on his own. He was willing to attack the Republican Party establishment as well as the Democratic Party establishment, and so he was able to kind of rabble rouse successfully. And I think after 10 years, and this is the point you were sort of alluding to just a minute ago, I mean, he was president. He's been president for 5.5 years, obviously, and the leader basically of the opposition for the other 4. That's had a big effect. I mean, just him being the leader of the party and leader of the nation for half that time, and just over and over, not sort of modifying his message, not reaching out to be president of all the people, not, okay, I did that in the campaign, but now I'm going to be more responsible, which is your typical kind of, presidential thing. The opposite, really, right? And so once you have someone who's a good demagogue, stoking fears and anxieties and being willing to not just capitalize on anger, but increase people's anger and intolerance, really, and find, people to blame and scapegoats and all that. 10 years, that's had a big effect over these 10 years. So I think one of the questions is what caused Trump, and then the other side of it is how much Trump has accelerated or intensified that what was already beginning to happen.
Full disclosure, I'm Roben Farzad. We're joined by Bill Kristol. He is, of course, editor-at-large and co-founder of the Bulwark, the wildly successful site that started as a Never Trumper project back in 2018. It just got a great write-up in the Wall Street Journal. He was, of course, founder of the Weekly Standard, where I used to watch you on Fox News, on ABC, on CNN. I mean, it was a whole different era. And it's amazing right now that we're talking about kind of the wings of both parties really kind of eating their old establishment figures. Surely you read what was in the Wall Street Journal, but it's this transcript of that cantankerous lunch with Senate Republicans and Donald Trump this week. It reminded me of that scene. Was it Robert De Niro in The Untouchables with the baseball bat?
Right.
Like, talk about whipping people into shape. Like, you're a loser. You know, people standing up and people who have nothing to lose at this point. It's like, you're gone. Who cares what you say? I'm kind of glad that happened this week, because I want to ask you, you kind of lead by fear in this position, right? He's not at a point of consolidating gains anymore. Yeah, I'm going to be a lame duck out of the midterms. He's really primarying people and threatening to primarying people still for perceived slights from back in 2000, like John Cornyn. I don't ultimately understand what his beef was with this otherwise popular establishment Republican senator in Texas, but he felt like he had to ding him as well. Explain that to me.
Yeah, well, one thing Trump did see, that again, the strength of the Tea Party and its sort of populist derivatives. So at a place like Texas, Paxton also had won statewide. And so I don't think Trump was taking such a risk, actually, in preferring Paxton. In fact, they'd won in the first round, but got about the same amount of vote. And Cornyn was ultimately an establishment guy, and Trump wants a party that will respond to him, just like he wants an administration that will respond to him. This is where the second term has been so different from the first term. He did a little bit of this in the first term in terms of did a lot of bullying and intimidating and threatening of primaries.
But there were guardrails. He had Mad Dog
huge
Mattis.
Guardrails. I mean, the establishment.
He had the Exxon CEO who was a state secretary.
No,
there
yeah,
were people
no.
who would really push back.
Even,
I mean, he was fired on the toilet, but you know,
even someone like Bill Barr, who I think
right.
didn't behave entirely respectably as Attorney General, at the end of the day, he wouldn't go along, obviously, with January 6th. And that was true of so many of them. But you're right, Mattis and Chief of Staff John Kelly and John Bolton, again, you could disagree with him, but there were things he wouldn't do and he didn't do, in fact, when Trump tried to get him and his staff at the NSC to go with Trump on Ukraine in 2019. That was really what
people
led
forget
to
that
first impeachment. You know, people forgot that, right?
There was no quid
pro
quo. People forget. I mean, it's been such a frenetic time and
right.
so many taboos shattered that people forget that thing. It was right on the eve of COVID. I did not blackmail Zelensky. There was no quid pro quo.
Yeah.
You know,
but I mean, now I do think this is where the second term is both so different internally. No guardrails. I mean, the Kash Patel, you know, Pete Hegseth, Bill Pulte administration, very self-consciously desired to be that by Trump, and with Stephen Miller and Russ Vought in the White House. I mean, it's all Trump, and we'll see what he wants to have those people do in terms of, you know, election subversion and all that's another story, and authoritarianism. But he learned that lesson from the first term. And in terms of the party, I guess I do think part of it's just over time, the non-Trumpy types have left, gotten older, new people have come in. If you wanted to run in the Republican Party in the last 5, 6, 7 years, your chances of running as a Trump Republican were unbelievably better than if you ran as a non-Trump or certainly a Republican. Certainly you couldn't run as an anti-Trump Republican. I had one or two friends who tried and they got crushed. And then Liz Cheney ultimately in 2022 got crushed. And that was kind of the end of that in the party, I would say. So, I mean, I do think he succeeded in taking over the party, which is very important. You know, Trump, if he had been president from 2016 to 2020, it had been Trump. But the party had sort of decided, basically, Paul Ryan and McConnell and a lot of the senior people on the Hill and some of the governors, you know, we're going to be polite to him. We'll support him when we think he's doing the right thing, but we are not going to view ourselves as his lieutenants on the Hill. We're going to check him when we need to. And this has happened elsewhere in the world. This has happened actually at the state level at times when a sort of fluky candidate got elected. And they did not make that decision. And I think that was fateful because once he had one of our two major parties under his control, then he was able to come back in 2022, 23, 24. And then the second term, they're still under his control. And now he's doing things that they never would have accepted 18 months ago. The idea that these people would vote for Pete Hegseth for defense secretary or Kash Patel or whatever was ridiculous. It would have been ridiculous back in 2017. And Trump didn't even try it, if you think about it, right? But by 2025, it was all Trump all the time.
Fealty and loyalty.
And part of that is that also the new people who got elected agreed more with Trump. It was, some people sort of say, well, he intimidated them, and that's true for the older ones and the less Trumpy ones. But a lot of them, they were just on board, and this was the Republican Party. This was the conservative movement they knew. They liked it. They agreed with it. They didn't see anything wrong with it. And I think some liberal observers, some of my friends, liberal friends, are sort of, they don't quite want to honestly accept that. They want to hope that deep down all these Republicans on the Hill really dislike Trump and don't agree with him. Not true. A lot of them like him, agree with him, think they've been doing well. I mean, Trump, after all, has won 2 out of the 3 last elections. They got a majority in both houses. He's got a Supreme Court that mostly goes along with him.
Supreme Court justices and maybe another one on the way if Clarence Thomas retires. But I did see this headline today, Bill, in the Wall Street Journal. It says, and this is it doesn't jibe with Trump being a person who does not like losers and doesn't want to lose. How Iran devastated an American naval base and caused a U.S. recalculation. I can't reconcile that with Trump refusing to give up the election and the results in early 2021 in the insurrection and egging on that mob to go down Pennsylvania Avenue. How did this just happen in Iran? It seems so easy. This year starts off with him extracting Nicolas Maduro from Caracas, like one of those, arcade game things where you could take little teddy bears out. It was just too easy. And maybe that emboldened him against the best advice of the professional military people he had and the chiefs of staff and the others to attempt the same thing in Iran. And yet they go and they execute people left and right in Iran. And it seems like child's play. If I was just an AP history, human geography student in 10th grade, I could tell you that the Iranians will bottleneck Hormuz. How could it have been this easy that became their nuclear option, that they held the global economy over a barrel? Do you see what I'm saying? Is there a possibility that this is all a bluff, that he's still trying to fatten up the Iranians for maybe another wave of attacks after the midterms? Because this is too easy. You talk about carrot and stick. Suddenly, the stick is gone and he's offering them upwards of, $100 billion, $200 billion of aid if they behave.
No, I think he got into this partly out of the overconfidence that you describe, partly because he was talked into it by Bibi Netanyahu and also by advisors here in the U.S. who, sincerely and honestly thought we can defeat Iran, and we can, if we put enough pressure on them, even if we don't use ground troops, the rebellion or the dissension that certainly manifested itself in January could come back up, and the regime could crumble, and that would be good. It would be good to get rid of that regime, but Trump was never going to do what really would have been necessary, it turns out, which was, and I'm not sure could have been done anyway, which is send in a lot of ground troops, a la Iraq. The one thing he had run against, and he knew, it doesn't work for American presidents to send in a lot of ground troops. He got himself a little bit in between. I mean, honestly, he should have done what he did. From his point of view, the bombing for 2 weeks seemed to work pretty well. I think we now know it didn't work quite as well as they said, but whatever. It wasn't, from America. I mean, it killed a lot of innocent people, obviously school children and schoolgirls, but still, I mean, from a Trump's point of view, he could say, I've set them back. The missile program's set back. They're not as strong as they were. They're not going to be a threat. They can't export terrorism as much as they did. And, we're stopping. And, we can always go back and do it again, right? And that would have been the rational thing about 2 weeks in. But instead, he felt like he would lose face if he started to yield because they were threatening to close and then did close the strait. And he got talked into, well, just hang in there. The global economy won't be that bad. The gas prices won't be that bad. If you just keep the pressure on.
The Islamic Republic's Navy was destroyed, Bill. How do they not know how the most powerful, maybe number one or number two Navy in the world, how can it not stent the Strait of Hormuz?
So we could
How
have.
is that not even part of Hegseth's
Well, but it's not so.
I don't really get it.
But it's not so easy. I've talked to a lot of, as you have, to a lot of big shots, military history types, but also actually, current and very recently retired admirals and those kinds of military experts. It's doable. We did it in the 80s. We actually went through the straits and kept it open, but it was a big thing. And you take casualties and you inflict casualties, and you're in a war that Trump didn't have the stomach for. I mean, the reason he did 2020 January 6th and not Iran is that January 26th was about him staying in power. Iran was about arguably the national interest of the U.S. It was about, or it should have been about helping the people of Iran. It was about global, regional, the Gulf and regional stability and so forth. Trump doesn't care much about any of those things. And so he started looking, I think, don't you think, about 2 or 3 weeks in for a way to get out. And that's why he's continuing to look to get out and not really reacting much when the Iranians do things that normally would be considered kind of provocative. And the Iranians, I'm struck by how much they are just twisting the knife on Trump. They want to humiliate him. But one remembers, 1980, 81, right? They were going to release the hostages, and they don't do it until Carter leaves the presidency. They just wanted to humiliate Carter, and
you know what's a footnote of history that I kind of almost want to have Steve Bannon on the show. Forgive me, because was he not in the Navy livid when Carter botched that rescue operation? Was that not kind of his foreign policy worldview coming of age? And the young developer Donald Trump, for the entire 80s and 90s, was saying it was so feckless how we enabled Iran to happen. So you get this great big chance. You and Bibi Netanyahu tell the world that the street, it will be free. It will be yours to take. Maybe 30 or 40,000 people were killed. Maybe 10,000. I don't know what it is. Was that all just bluster?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think Netanyahu thought really we just wanted to weaken the regime as much as possible. Thought you might get the real popular revolt. I think for Trump, it was, as you say, Venezuela went so well, sort of, that, we'll see what really happens in Venezuela, but it looks good. And so he thought he could get away with that. But I've always thought for him, the foreign policy kind of imperialism was about his ego, too. It was about being a super big shot and the most powerful man in the world. And I've got this military, look at it. But when the going got tough, he was not interested in being a wartime president, because that's a difficult thing and a tough thing. He is interested in keeping power in the U.S., incidentally. And so that's why January 6th was different. And that's why he cares more about going after his domestic opponents, honestly, than foreign regimes, I think.
Full disclosure, please stay with us. This show runs on NPR, Spotify. You can please watch us on YouTube. All the links at one neat place for you, fulldradio.com. Again, fulldradio.com. I'd like to shout out our listeners on WVTF Radio IQ across the great Commonwealth. We are down in Asheville, North Carolina on WPVM. I'd love to be there. I'd love to vacation there. It would be a lot cooler. Out west on KPPQ in Ventura, California. Holler if you too would like us on your air, and catch me every week on both CNN and NPR's Here and Now. If you're just joining us, my guest, I'm so thrilled to have him on finally, is Bill Kristol. He's, of course, a co-founder of the Bulwark, the wildly successful Never Trumper site that started in 2018. He's editor-at-large there. He was a founder of the Weekly Standard, which wasn't it called mandatory in-flight reading for the Oval Office back in the day?
Maybe. I think New Republic was in the 80s.
The New Republic.
We picked that up a little bit in the Bush administration, I would say. Yeah.
And what's amazing is you were a Cold War Democrat. Like, I think about these archetypes: Rockefeller Republicans, Graham Rudman types. I think about these old fabled characters. If you follow the investing community, we've said it in other shows, there used to be bond vigilantes and right. Inflation hawks and the like. And I was like, my kids asked me about these things. I was like, really? They did exist, and they'd give us toasters at banks and stuff. But that's neither here nor there. I'd like to start this thing that I've been meditating on, and it's germane to where I'm taking this conversation. So please bear with me. What was Yahiwa Sinwar romancing when he masterminded October 7th? Of course, if he was successful, and tragically was very successful in getting through it, there was a failure of imagination, but Lebanon and Iran did not follow suit with the missile volleys, and he didn't get the support. And yet Gaza is razed. There were tens of thousands of people killed. Israel has never been as unpopular, I think, in recent history in terms of U.S. polling. And Iran was shelled. If I told you that, less than 3 years after this atrocity, that the Ayatollah of Iran would be killed, but maybe he was thinking the long game. Maybe he was thinking that this was the only way out for Gaza and Hamas, and the dream of a Palestinian state was to have absolute global blowback against the United States and Israel, especially Israel under Bibi Netanyahu. Do you ever think about that? It's not like he left a letter. I think David Remnick has tried to write about this. I've had several academics and Hamas scholars on the show, and I always wonder, what was he thinking? And is it possible that if you think about the Democratic Party today, if you think about the backlash to Israel and the support for Palestine in the United States, that maybe he was onto this?
Yeah, it's hard for me. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know enough about sort of what he was thinking or his colleagues. But I think generally, if you are a man of violence, if I can put it that way, a terrorist, you are willing to tolerate an awful lot of chaos. You think chaos is your friend, and therefore the current situation was unacceptable to him, right? So what could be worse from his point of view? Well, some things could be worse, but he was willing to take that risk in the hope that he would generate a mass conflagration in the Middle East that either in the short, or as you sort of suggest, in the medium or longer term, would be very bad for the hated enemy Israel, and would be good, even though it wasn't in the short term, for his people. And so I do think the risk-taking of terrorists, of people who, well, terrorists is, I mean, he's a terrorist, but or just say more broadly of people who feel they have nothing to lose is very great. I mean, there are two kinds of risk takers. There are people who feel they have nothing to lose and people who feel they're on top of the world and they can get away with it. And that would be more Putin, I guess, in Ukraine. I do think one lesson of the last 3 or 4 years, just as someone, used to teach political science and interested in history, the world is really unpredictable. We have all these scholars and they kind of sometimes say, well, this is how this is going to go and this is how that's going to go. The number of people, this is your point, sort of, right, who, if we had gotten together 5 years ago, maybe in 2021, Biden takes over, things are going to calm down, back to normalcy. So we're going to have the largest land war in Europe in 80 years. We're going to have this massive, most successful attack on Israel in, I guess, in 73 at least.
Entire history, yeah.
Then we're going to have a massive destruction of Gaza. We're going to have attacks on Israel and from Israel to Iran. And as you say, the killing of the Ayatollah after all these years and a lot of other people too. And the U.S. involved in a war, which then Iran's going to basically win by closing the strait and so Trump not having the willingness to, Iran being more willing to escalate than Trump, and more willing to take a huge amount of punishment, obviously. And the whole thing has been remarkable. And then Trump coming into power and basically deciding, I don't like that old international system, the alliances, the liberal, the U.S.-led world order. And so I'm just going to walk away from it. And together we have a world that is pretty, I won't say unrecognizable, but it's getting that way, don't you think? And
then I also thought of you when I'm thinking about the asymmetry of things right now, drone warfare, how
yes.
Ukraine is really gumming up the works with this like rugged individualism of drones, like the old army things, the drones in I wouldn't say it's a Suez crisis, but Strait of Hormuz, it's been giving the United States a really hard time. There's this kill zone and this impasse between Russia and Ukraine. Crimea is being brought up again and relitigated. And do you see what I'm saying? It's a time of unbelievable seismicity in terms. UAE suddenly pulls out of OPEC, to say nothing that if I had taken you back 10 or 15 years and said, Bill Kristol, we're going to look into the crystal ball.
Yeah.
President Donald Trump will have Ayatollah Khamenei killed, right? And the UAE and Israel will be attacked and everything in the stock market will be at an all-time high. I think it goes back to your point of kind of global volatility and planning that we really never could have imagined.
No, I mean, Trump is president and everything he's doing. The apparent, as what I guess Chancellor Merz of Germany called the rupture, or maybe it was Carney of Canada, but they're both correct. The rupture, the break in the old world order, and the sense that everything is now up in the air. Technological revolutions happening at the same time on the military side with drones, which seems like a very big one. I mean, certainly at the level of some of the other technological developments we've seen in the last century. AI, just to mention that. I mean, it just does feel like we have a lot of sort of things happening at once on the political sphere and the sort of social sphere and the economic sphere and the technological sphere. So yeah, God knows where this all ends up.
Bill, you're a native New Yorker, right? Born in Manhattan?
Right.
Tell me about what just happened in New York. Obviously, Mayor Zoran Mamdani, there was a lot of pushback in that. The Democratic Socialists of America are ascendant, but you're able to say the quiet part out loud now. Back when I was in college, you couldn't even say Free Palestine. And now you could very easily thumb your nose against the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee and Chuck Schumer and the proxies and the others. It seems to have worked in the lower Manhattan district and in Brooklyn and in other areas. And there's a concern. Is this a whole new playbook? Just like you could never imagine Trump bringing out the far right the way he did. The Democrats are feeling their oats on the far left and kind of, say the quiet part out loud, if I may use that term.
Yeah, when you sort of asked me if I was in New York, I thought we were going to talk about the Knicks, but that's okay.
We will.
We don't have to relish that fantastic, extraordinary
victory. He's dining out on that thing. We're huge fans, right? I was a Lakers fan, and this is the first time since 1973, right? And the city was euphoric, and the scenes of Caribbean people
those were great,
in
right?
Crown Heights with Orthodox Jews, like, you love it, No, even if Penn Station is in terrible shape. Go ahead.
I felt the Knicks celebrations, and now actually the World Cup, are for someone like me who's anti-Trump kind of something to look at it and think, you know what, a lot of America is not where Trump and his supporters are, So that
Scott's taking over Boston and drinking it out of beer and whatnot.
That's crazy. I was up in Boston for a day last week. It was insane. They were everywhere. They were like, walk out of your getting coffee.
But I say, Bill, if you look at half of Instagram, we're exporting diabetes because they're going to Buc-ee's and all these other places. Like, it's so large.
I know.
Go ahead.
So on the more serious note, so I guess the question is, and it really is a question, is clearly, yes, there's been a pretty big dramatic move in the direction you mentioned. I guess looking back, one sees AOC in 2018 as the harbinger of it, and then these races this year. And so, but is it in New York? They're all in New York. So Is it a New York City phenomenon? The rest of the country, there's a little bit of it elsewhere, but it's also the case that, I don't know, even 100 miles north of New York, a very traditional, actually, Democrat was a military vet, won a primary up there in New York 17, and then in many other states, obviously, I live in Virginia, we have Abigail Spanberger, we have Mark Warner. It doesn't feel like there's a huge, radicalization.
And Abigail Spanberger has pushed back at that, never mentioned defund the police again. She's really the antidote to this,
different parts of the country are pretty different. I would say, for me, though, and this I do think among younger voters, certainly on the Israel-Palestine issue, there's been a fundamental change, and I think Gaza really is we'll see what happens. And the combination of Trump and Netanyahu being so closely bound, and if you're a young, liberal-minded person, you don't like either of them really, and then they sort of define Israel, and they define the U.S.-Israel relationship, and suddenly you're against that whole relationship, and then there's the terrible, deaths in Gaza. And
you saw J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance actually,
and then on the right, it's a whole different. It's a similar. It's a different.
Wasn't it unthinkable when you were in the Bush 41 White House? Wasn't that James Baker testimony where he said, "When you're serious about peace, call this number," and that was considered taboo, right, for the early 90s. But for J.D. Vance to come out of here and saying you have no other friends and you can't just kill yourself out of all your problems, that's a leap of faith on his part. He's espousing a wing of the party, maybe Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson, that right now is openly kind of Israel skeptic.
No, I agree. I mean, of course, the Republican Party before I got to Washington was also, was more Israel skeptic than the Democrats, and was sort of friendly with Arab oil interests and all that. Baker, in a weird way, was almost left over from that side of the party. He wasn't that friendly to Israel. But, I do think that's a new phenomenon. And so in both parties, you have much more hostility to Israel, but also and I think it also goes hand in hand with the general rise of a kind of, I don't know how to put it, willingness to just attack groups and other nations, but also ethnic groups, religious groups that you don't like, and attack them much more. In the old days, you might say, well, I disagree with people on this issue, but of course I respect people of all faiths. People say that sort of sometimes still, but it's gotten to be a little less civil. I mean, this again, I think is primarily a Trump phenomenon, but there obviously are others on the right and then people on the left who have gone in that direction too. I mean, one thing I just think we don't know is, I said before that I thought, well, we don't know on the Israel issue how much difference it makes if Netanyahu loses in October and then Trump leaves office in 2 years. How different do people have? How much different a sense do they have?
Well, no, imagine the
and on the American side, on the American side, it's really a bigger question. Even the big version of this question is Trump. I mean, I don't know. I can argue that he's changed everything and it's not going to go back, and it could keep going in that direction, or it could go in very different directions. But in any case, we're in a very new era. That's what I'm inclined to believe. But what that era looks like, when Trump leaves, all kinds of things they don't revert to normal exactly, but they don't go in a Trumpy direction. Whether the Democrats in a way become more moderate after they don't have to fight Trump all the time. I don't know. I think we just don't know. We've never had an experience like this. Trump dominant for a decade. What is that? What is the post-Trump
Do you
era
think
look like?
A lot is made of the Rubio and J.D. Vance binary? Rubio is still a kind of a forcefully pro-Israel, wants to take out, there's some neocon hints to him. He did get unanimous confirmation in the U.S. Senate, which is kind of unthinkable today, right?
Right.
Is he the last hope for kind of that bastion?
I don't know. I think it's
and then I would ask you also on the Democratic side,
so
like Gavin Newsom or these other candidates, they can now be openly saying proudly, "I turn away AIPAC money."
Yeah, no, that is striking. So on the Republican side, I think the party is going to be pretty Trumpy for a while. It doesn't mean forever, but I do not think in 2028. I think whoever Trump endorses, if he endorses someone, wins. I think if Trump runs again, he probably wants the nomination. He could get it, despite the Constitution. If he wants to put a family member even up, maybe that person wins. I think Trump still has enough of a hold on enough of the base. This can be hard not to be Trumpy. I'm a little bit of a skeptic about both Vance and Rubio. I just feel like, I don't know, we're in such an unconventional moment in American politics. In the normal world, yes, the vice president, the successful sort of secretary of state, former senator, those would be two obvious candidates. They will both run, I suppose, but if Trump doesn't. But I don't know. It could be some outsider. It could be all kinds of other people.
Bill, what just shifted in the Middle East? Though, when you see the alliances, did we just see a World War I like realignment? Like Saudi Arabia has had this fissure with the UAE.
So
UAE
I think it's
clearly has a vested interest in globalization, wants to be a global nation. Has the drone tech of Israel is very necessary. Something fundamentally did shift as I was seeing Iran shell the heck out of the UAE. These
I
things,
would
again,
say,
would have been unthinkable a year ago.
yeah, I mean, I think things have shifted a lot. I think we don't know where they end up. But I would say the only thing I would say is that, I mean, I feel like it's very unpredictable. Things are up in the air, is the way I would put it. I mean, we're not like shifting from situation A to situation B. We don't know what situation B is. I had friends who were very enthusiastic about the Abraham Accords, and I was always a little skeptical that that was really, that was going to be the future. It could be part of the future. And there are elements, of course. They still have flights going from Tel Aviv to Dubai and all that. So that's nice, I guess. But I don't know. But as you say, who expected, Iran to be shelling the UAE and other nations in the Gulf, and then them shelling back, and the U.S. not really helping our allies, who, of course, we had said, don't worry, we've got your back. And then it's like, well, actually, we can't really protect you much. In fact, we can't really protect our own bases much. I think that's, incidentally, you mentioned it, I think, briefly before. That's an underreported story. I mean, when people in the U.S. military and but also around the world realize these bases are not easy to defend, and if Iran can hit them, God knows what Russia or China or other nations could do if in a pinch. And
which you read my mind. I have to be asking what Xi Jinping is thinking at a moment.
Yeah, and I think
these guys are caught so unawares. Could I potentially snap up Taiwan?
Right, and I think he probably, well, who knows? He probably won't for now, because he's actually, things are going his way anyway, and he can just put pressure on Taiwan. And Trump, he probably thinks, won't necessarily resist that pressure. But I don't think anything's out of the, as I say, given that we wouldn't have predicted Putin's invasion of Ukraine, we wouldn't have predicted, I don't think, the war in Iran. I don't have any confidence that I have any idea what's going to happen in 2027,
Bill Kristol, in the few minutes I have left with you, and again, I could go on for hours and hours and hours. I wonk out on your stuff. I used to read you in the Weekly Standard. I loved your commentaries on TV. You've been part of so many different White Houses. Again, the Venn diagram of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and then working for Dan Quayle, which I never hear from Dan Quayle anymore. He's like a private equity macher now, right?
Yeah.
We never see him on the news or anything anymore, but let's save that for the very end. I want to talk to you about the media writ large, right? Paramount, which is run by Trump allies, the Ellison families, on the verge of snapping up Warner Brothers, which owns CNN, which both of us, I think, appear on from time to time. They'd already snapped up CBS News and moved it more to the right, I would imagine. The Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. It has been kind of defanged in terms of taking on Trump as much as it used to. You now are a media exec as well. And a lot of people are turning to a third way in what you offer, maybe in what other, Vox Podcast Network was just acquired. We are being able to opt into different media channels right now because cable TV is dying, because the print industry has been in this long, inexorable decline. Comment on the experience with the Bulwark and how you've come together, how you brought together the likes of Tim Miller and other people who are disaffected in this community. I mean, Liz Cheney, the fact that Liz Cheney was giving a speech in Richmond and extolling Abigail Spanberger, and the fact that Dick Cheney and AOC voted for the same person in 2024, again, it blows my mind, for lack of another verb.
No, and I think, the media, the transformation of the media landscape, which you sketched, is another element of the kind of just new world that we're in, and we don't know where it ends up. I mean, people talk about it kind of sort of certain confidence. Well, clearly we're going in this direction, and clearly it's going to end up, well, I don't know where it's going to end up. Do things keep fragmenting, or there are new consolidations, as you see some of each? Clearly, some of the ways people are learning things and reading news and listening to news are very, very different from what they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so, again, I have no confidence that I have any crystal ball on this one at all. I mean, the Bulwark was, like many good things, I think, in life, sort of an accident. I mean, the Weekly Standard got closed by our owner because we were anti-Trump, and he wanted it to be okay with Trump. And then we wanted to buy from him, but he wouldn't sell it or whatever. Kind of unpleasant ending, unfortunately, in 2018. And a few of us got together 2 weeks afterwards. We were closed right before Christmas, and said, I don't know, maybe we should try something. Websites are pretty easy to start up. Charlie Sykes was there, and he did a podcast, and Jonathan Last was our online editor. So JVL, he could edit and write, and a couple other people. And Sarah Longwell, whom I'd met in Never Trump World in 2017, so was willing to be the publisher and take on some of that burden and raise money and so forth. And so we really started in the borrowed office at a firm called Berman. And And one thing led to another, and Tim Miller joined, and that was great. And others have joined, and we've recruited others, and it's become a real, it's been great to be a part of it, honestly. And they deserve most of the credit, Sarah and JVL and Tim and others. I mean, they've done
what's amazing
the heavy lifting. I helped at the beginning.
Legacy Media making overtures to bring you back in.
Yeah, I know.
Tim and Sarah are regulars on the old MSNBC. It's MS Now, as they realize that Mindshare has moved on to the Podcastosphere and newsletters and Substack. Again, I would not have imagined you as MSNBC people 10 years ago, right? Those lines have been completely blurred. And especially if we see CNN tack to the right or become more of a kind of a Trump curious, Trump friendly platform. I'm saying it is opportunistic for you guys.
As you say, the cable stuff, I mean, it used to be early Bulwark. It'd be great to be on MSNBC or CNN, very good publicity for Bulwark. And still we have that attitude basically. So I'm sure you do too, and we all do to some degree. On the other hand, honestly, Tim Miller's podcast, I'll just a couple of numbers. So Tim Miller's podcast, which he does one a day, every day, and he does a lot of other video stuff too. But the big podcast gets about usually 250,000 viewers on YouTube, maybe another 150,000 on the podcast, and then a bunch of others who see the clips, and obviously other stuff gets picked up. That's a big number. I mean, it's not like CNN doesn't get much bigger numbers, certainly not, well, sometimes it does, but not often. And incidentally, those numbers are worth more. And I say that, I don't mean this in some, metaphysical way. I just mean people are choosing, this from your podcast, people are choosing to listen or watch, right? They're clicking.
Well, my mother-in-law is watching us right now.
But I mean, they don't get CNN. I like CNN. I respect CNN. I have many, many good friends who are CNN. I like being on CNN or MSN, but they're on, the TV's on somewhere. And people are watching it or they're not watching it. They see the 6-minute segment. Oh, I see that guy. I watch him. I'm not really watching. I'm busy now. I'm sorry. I can't watch. So what I'm struck by in podcast world and YouTube world and also website world, web world, newsletter world, people are saying, I want to listen to this. Now, they don't listen to the whole thing necessarily. If it's boring, they turn it off. So obviously those numbers are a little inflated in the sense that they're not watching every minute. But a lot of them are watching a lot of it. And again, they're choosing to do that. And that's also true with newsletters. You know what your click-through rate is. So you know how many people are reading the news. We put so much work into the Weekly Standard. We're very proud of it. We were thrilled if once online stuff began, if the combined print and online readership for an article would be maybe 150,000, 200,000. We get a lot of stuff in the Bulwark. Our newsletter goes to where the daily newsletters go to 850,000 people or something like that who have signed up for it. We're not buying email lists. They've signed up affirmatively for it. Maybe 350,000 of them open it. Just my newsletter. So that's the one I know the numbers for a little bit. And they don't all read all of it. I understand that they open it. They look at it. Oh, Kristol's writing about ICE. I don't care about that. They don't read it, but whatever. But most do probably. So the numbers, the ability with modern technology, with current technology to get to a lot of people, I'm sure you're finding this too, is really pretty astounding. And I still don't think we haven't quite internalized that in the media world. It's still like, well, there's the serious stuff and then there's the podcast, but that's not, and the video. But YouTube now has more. YouTube is like the biggest media operation.
It's the biggest channel ever created.
Isn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
But it's owned by another tech giant. I mean, that's what it brings us back to, this thing. And just as a footnote to this, the Murdoch son that kind of lost out and his family is affiliated with this project. I mean, Rupert Murdoch did sell off the Weekly Standard. He was the initial investor and owner to the Anschutz family. That didn't work out. But the Murdoch family, who just consolidated control of the Vox Media Podcast Network and others, is an investor.
They were donors they were investors or donors to the original foundation that owned the Bulwark. The Bulwark then went private and stuff. But yeah, we have there's some relationship between some of the stuff we do and Catherine and James Murdoch. Yeah.
Well, in closing, I have to ask you about the Democratic Socialists of America. I wish I had all the time in the world with you, Bill. But is it as equidistant to potentially winning a presidential election or control of the party as MAGA was in 2015, 2016? If people said that could never happen, who's to say that a Democratic ascendancy, especially, you and I did not mention this terrible inflation that was a staccato trauma that came after, if you had 9/11, the Iraq War, you had the great financial crisis, the pandemic inflation, people are in a lousy mood. And many New Yorkers I know are making more than $200,000 a year, who are very open to the idea of, city hall subsidized groceries and rent controls and the other. Who's to say that this doesn't take over the zeitgeist of the Democratic Party?
No, I totally agree. I mean, the only thing I would add, I suppose, is I think the Democratic Party is really ripe, well, both parties are, for a generational change. I mean, it's kind of crazy. We've had Trump 3 times in a row. He's now 80. We've had, on the Democratic side, Hillary, who'd been around a long time, Joe Biden, who'd really been around a long time, and then Kamala Harris hadn't been around so long, but unfortunately for her, Biden was the one who was running until 100 days before the election. So, I mean, it's really nuts when you think about it. Trump, Clinton, Biden, sort of Biden, Harris. I mean, that's changing in both parties, I assume. And I think we will have a big interest in fresh faces and generational change. And that needn't be to the left. Incidentally, they're very impressive young Democrats who are not particularly left, who are many of them 9/11 veterans and so forth. Same with Republicans. There are younger Republicans who are MAGA and younger Republicans who aren't. But I think the generational change will happen. And I think you're right on the Democratic side. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, is there going to be a recession? We've had inflation. What if there's also a big recession? What if AI really blows up in some sense, that it really turns out to be a huge, bigger problem than we think in terms of job loss, but also in terms of some of the sociological effects almost? What if it, starts escaping captivity and there are all these horror stories? People will not be interested in people will be interested in a sort of anti-tech bro, anti-oligarch, trillionaire, billionaire message. One thing I do think is I think both the Democrats certainly have to be economically populist. They should, in my opinion, there are responsible ways to be populist, and I would certainly argue for those. But they can't be sort of knee-jerk defenders of the current establishment, either the political establishment or the economic establishment.
Bill Kristol, editor-at-large and co-founder of The Bulwark. Of course, he was founder of the Weekly Standard, which I read for years. You told me you were a Cold War Democrat. Were you in the Do Nothing Party? Were you a Whig? Were you a Tory?
Yeah,
I mean, these old things don't apply, like Graham Rudman types, McCain Republicans. You just don't hear about them anymore. New England Republicans, when Mitt Romney was governor, was this enlightened governor of Massachusetts. My kids are young. They don't believe me that this stuff existed back in the day.
It could come back though, right? I mean, when Trump announced America First in 2016, that was his slogan and stuff. I thought that's ridiculous. It was a discredited movement, really a discreditable movement. It had faded into obscurity after its 2 years in 1939, 40, 41, basically of fame and then being disgraced. And then here we are, right? 10 years later. And everyone's, I'm an America First Republican. I'm an America First person. Even to criticize Trump in the Republican Party, you have to say, well, I'm really America First. Trump is moving away from it. So I don't know. Maybe all these things will come back,
Thank you for coming on. I love having you and Tim Miller and the like on. We'll invite Sarah when the book comes on.
Great.
Consider yourself a friend of the show.
Well, I appreciate that. I've really enjoyed the discussion. It was fun.
Full disclosure, special thanks to Ian Stewart. If you are listening to us on the radio, note that while we cut for broadcast length, the entirety of every interview is on podcast. We are on the NPR network, Spotify, Apple. Watch us on YouTube. You could find them all at one link, fulldradio.com. Again, fulldradio.com. And please do recommend us to a friend. A shout out to our home station, WVTF Radio IQ, Virginia's NPR news source. DM me to carry us on your air. And catch me every week on both CNN and NPR's Here and Now. I'm Roben Farzad. Thank you for listening. Back with you next week.